All right, welcome to our first video of week 3, and actually our only video as far as my materials go. There might be something from the student presentation this week. I don't know what format they're going to present in, but yes, this is the one video. I have some other some articles and videos, for us to discuss for part of our 3B discussion, and then otherwise it's going to be the student presentations. So we have a couple topics we're going to cover right now. We're going to start with pre- and non-marital relationships, beginning with the hookup. In case you haven't gotten the notice, dating is now dropping as far as a common way for college age and young adult people to meet, and the hookup is rising. This is based off of England and Thomas's findings. While their sample is geared more towards the college campus and they're confining their results, it's seeing now that young adults too are meeting each other in different ways and having these hookup things even outside of the college context. All right, so let's just review what we've seen in the past. In the upper right, we see a courting couple, from the Victorian era. This is when two adults of marital age would meet each other in a public place. They would have their conversation be private, but they were very public. Kind of the whole community was chaperoning them in that sense. And they were getting to know each other on a path towards marriage. And then on the left, we have the coming to call or calling. A young woman would invite a boy to come to her, or a girl would invite a boy or young man to come to her house under the supervision of her parents. Her parents would provide refreshments, usually cookies and lemonade. And they would sit on the porch where they would have, again, privacy as far as verbal privacy, but their physical presence was very public. And they would talk to one another and get to know each other that way. Then around 1910, in full force in 1920, we see dating coming on the scene. This is when women didn't really command much of any sort of wages, but men or young older teens and young men did, and so they would financially provide for the date. So that it would turn from the woman asking for calling a man for a man or a boy to call at her house to a boy or a man asking a young woman or girl out on a date. And this was suddenly a much more private. It was sometimes parts of the date took place in public, but they were really on their own and they could have gone just about anywhere. They had this sort of privacy that came. Now we're in the era of hookups. And now dating is usually what a lot of college students say is what people do once they're in a relationship. They go on a date with their boyfriend or their girlfriend, and they have these events out together. Getting to know each other through dates is far less common. What happens now typically is a relationship follows a series of hookups. So people initiate their relationships through hooking up. So the physical intimacy becomes before the emotional intimacy through this model. So hookups, let's give us the social context of this whole phenomenon. And just in case you've been living under a rock, a hookup, we're going to define this as a physical encounter that's casual, that's sexually casual in some way. It can be confined to just kissing, but it can sometimes explore further sexuality than that. And so a casual encounter between two people that may or may not lead to a committed relationship. So this study took place in 2005. They looked at one college campus, and they did both survey and interview data. They surveyed 617 individuals, and they interviewed 270. And the data here is limited to heterosexuals just because they found a lot of different patterns. For this specific article that I'm drawing on, they confine their data to heterosexuals, but they have a larger study that looks at the whole data that includes homosexuals and various patterns there. So you can explore that if you're curious to do that on your own. So alcohol played an important role in hookups. Either some regretted their choices. They said, there's no way I would have done that had I not been drinking. And for others, it was liquid courage. They said, whoa, there's no way I would have done that if I hadn't been drinking. And so alcohol played a role that facilitated hookups, either to the happiness or the regret to the people who participated. Hookups are sometimes with strangers, but usually they know the person, even if they only casually know them. They're someone in my dorm. I had a class with them, that sort of thing. 20% of the people they surveyed never hooked up. 25% of the people have had 1 to 4 hookups. 20% have had 5 to 10 hookups, and 1/3 of the people have had 10 or more hookups. So we can see that this is fairly common. Only 20%, only 1 in 5 have never engaged in a hookup. So you can see that this is a pretty common occurrence. Even if it's not a habit for people, it's definitely something that people have engaged in at one time or another. Okay, hookups, the lowdown on the down low. What's going on with the hookups? Okay, so let's look at how sexually intimate hookups typically are. 1/3 of hookups involve kissing and other non-genital affection and displays of that kind. 19% are hand to genital contact. 22% involve oral sex of one or both partners, and 23% involve vaginal intercourse. So that is a pretty interesting breakdown. The vast majority, 2/3, involve some sort of genital contact, but only 1/3 maintain it just at the kissing level. So that's a sizable proportion as well. There is an interesting gender disparity as far as orgasms go. They call this the orgasm gap. So not only do we have a wage gap, as we hear in society, not only do we have a leisure gap, as Hochschild talks about, not only do we have all of these different gender gaps, we also have an orgasm gap in hookups. So this is interesting to see that it might not be quite as freeing for women as people might indicate, that this is something that needs to be addressed. 40% of men versus 14% of women have an orgasm in their hookup, and that's a self-report. Women, 14%, again, say that they've had an orgasm, but 30% of men report that the women had an orgasm. So we don't know what's going on in this disparity here. We don't know if women are pretending to have an orgasm. We don't know if men are lying and they just want to seem more like a stud or more egalitarian or whatever it is. But we see that there's some gap, and there's still even a gap as far as men's reporting. So even if there's still a 10%, even if men are being totally deceived and they believe that their partners are having orgasm, there's still a 10% gap of what's going on. So we need to address this orgasm gap, and it's a complex thing. It has to be addressed in multiple levels, right? Certain acts are more or less disparate. And these are all women and men's self-report. So it's not men reporting on women or women reporting on men. But women have, but 17% of people whose hookup encounter involves hand to genital contact, 17% of both parties show that they have an orgasm. For oral sex, 32% of women report an orgasm, while 84% of men report an orgasm. And for vaginal sex, 32% of women report an orgasm compared to 90% of men. So we see that the hand to genital has no orgasm gap, but at the same time, it doesn't really seem like a lot of people are getting orgasms anyway. So that's a whole nother thing to unpack within this. So combining the two charts, these two charts that we have of, they're not really charts, but data, they were charts inside of the article. But men report a fairer distribution than women. So again, are women faking or are men wanting to sound more fair or satisfying? It's up in the air. We can't tell. After several hookups, after two people hook up, after a few times, they have the DTR, the define the relationship talk. And this is when they decide whether or not they are official. So again, hookups are this physical way of leading to emotional intimacy. It's very interesting in this respect. It's opposite of what has been done of all the datings in the dating models in the past. Okay, so sexual double standard we have here. So women get a bad reputation among both men and women for having too many hookups. So there is that double standard. Whereas men who hook up a lot get respect from men, but lowered respect from women, but only temporarily from the women. Then they kind of can bounce back and they can see them as being human beings, and they went through a phase. But women kind of carry the marred reputation with them. Men are more likely than women, 37% to 27%, to respect someone less after a hookup, and women are more likely than men to feel less respected after a hookup, 51% versus 25%. So this is another huge issue, and this is now we're not just looking at the physical. The physical can be equally dangerous and have a serious impact on people, but now we're also looking at the psychological impacts and repercussions of hookup culture for us to consider. Women are more likely to associate sex with relationships rather than just recreation, unlike men. This is what they found within their interview and survey data. And this is a persistent phenomenon, the privileging of men's satisfaction and conquest and the social rejection of women's. But to what extent are women to blame if they are faking orgasms? That's a whole nother story. So it's hard for us to know what is going on because we don't fully understand what's going on in the orgasm gap. I don't know why I picked this picture. I think I was just like, how much longer can we talk about hookups? So the bored baby came in. But anyway, additional observations that they brought to the fore. A large social gap evolved between the meaning of oral sex and vaginal sex. Huge. This has changed. It used to be that like in the 1950s and 60s, oral sex was something that you did after you'd have vaginal sex, that this was like this special treat you gave your sexual partner. It was something that was considered very intimate, and it was a part of sex. It wasn't considered a step before sex. Today, the vast majority of people see oral sex as being third base, as being a substitute for vaginal sex, not quite as intimate, not quite as far, not quite as committed, and that sort of thing. And it's something that happens before vaginal sex. So there's definitely like this generation gap that's happening where people are confused. Like, what do you mean you're a virgin? You've had oral sex? No, well, I'm a virgin. I haven't had vaginal sex. So there's different ways of understanding what sex is. Sexual gratification is pretty easy to come by, as is opposite sex friendship due to co-ed dorms. This causes a drop in dating, right? So hookups allow easy sexual gratification for people if they want that. And we get our opposite sex friendships all the time. I'm sure tons of you guys have platonic friends, which wasn't really a thing in the 40s and 50s. You had same-sex friends. And you had opposite sex relationships, and that was the way it worked. But now we can get everything that we want. We have our friends, we have a hookup friend, we have our close friends, sometimes we have our friends with benefits. It's just all these different things. So there's this drop in dating that we really see. Hookup disadvantages those who want to save sexual activity for relationships because hookups are the natural path to relationships. So there are some people who are very resistant to this hookup culture, and they see it as not the way they want to create a relationship, not a genuine expression of their own sexuality and the meaning of it. And so having a predominantly hookup culture really kind of makes it difficult for these 20% of students, for example, at this university, who have never engaged in a hookup, to find a relationship if this is the quote natural pathway to finding relationships. Okay, some questions for us to think about. First, just think about them. What are the sexual relationship trends among college youth, and how did they get there? What advantages does the hookup offer? What sort of disadvantages does it offer? But then the one we're going to discuss in our either our Zoom meeting or online in the postings, how does the hookup support or undermine male-female friendship, relationships, and marriage, if at all? So think about the way that this really shapes your social fabric, both platonically and romantically, both short-term and with marriage. So think about that question when we go into our Zoom meetings and our online postings and answer it in those forums. All right, and the next topic we're going to look at is cohabitation. First comes love, not so much marriage anymore. Usually people live together before they get married. So this is a new trend that we're finding. Just to give us an idea of what the scope of what's happening right here, we're going to have some demographics. So just to introduce some social ideas. Marriage differs from cohabitation in that marriage has legal, moral, and social rules. Marriage is very well defined. In other words, marriage is an institution, right? We know what marriage is. It's you're married or you're not. There's expectations that go with it, morally and socially, legal expectations, all sorts of. It is very well defined. So we call it, and so within sociology, we call this an institution. Everyone knows what it is. It's like shaking hands with someone. That's an institution. We've got it. This is a common way of greeting. That's an institution. Cohabitation, though, is not so much. It's very fluid. It doesn't have much. There are legal ramifications to cohabiting, but they're minimal compared to marriage. And then the moral and social rules, those are fluid. Some people very much object to cohabitation. Some people are totally fine with it. Some say, no, you should cohabit before you're married. So this is very fluid. People get to construct their own ideas of what it means to cohabit. 8% of first marriages in the 1960s came from cohabiting couples, but by the mid-90s, this is a little dated, so it's it's even higher now. But by the mid-90s, 56% of first marriages came from cohabiting couples. The ending of a cohabiting relationship is not nearly as messy legally and does not carry the same stigma, right? People don't say like, oh, how many times have you cohabited, right? But people are, oh, wow, you've been divorced 3 times. That's a big deal. So people are more accepting of cohabitation today, the vast majority, compared to before, and don't see marriage as lifelong as they did in the past. That's not so much that you need to stick it out forever and ever. Some people have that, and some people, they aspire to that, but it's not socially the same expectation as what it was. Some more demographics. The highest rate of cohabitation we see are among the least educated. Some of this might have to do with income levels and that sort of thing. Cohabiting really makes a lot of sense financially, to share resources with people and that sort of thing. So being least educated probably does play into a lot of that. And also people who are educated tend to look for what is the socially most accepted thing. I've got my college degree, maybe I've got my graduate degree or some sort of certificate. I'm the aspiring middle to upper middle class. What do I need? What to make the package? I need home ownership. I need a spouse. And so people who have more education, because they've already bought into these middle class values of education, tend to buy into the package as well. So it doesn't have to do with people making poor decisions because they're less educated or anything like that. I don't want to imply that. Cohabitation happens before marriage and also after divorce. Roughly half of the people who were previously married in 1998 were in some sort of cohabiting relationship. In 1998, again, 37% of cohabiting couples have children living in the home, and that's up from 28% in 1978. In Scandinavian countries, it's completely a substitute for marriage. Couples usually do not marry before they have children. It's very uncommon for that, or not uncommon. It's fewer than half marry before children. Children of cohabiting parents are more likely to see separation, so something to keep in mind. And in the event of separation, are less supported by money and time of fathers. Again, because there aren't a lot of legal rules. There is child support that's mandated, but there's not a lot of the same social and moral functions with cohabiting. More demographics. Cohabitation attracts a certain kind of person, right? Who rejects the traditional gender roles. So people are self-selecting into cohabitation. A certain type of person is looking for a cohabiting relationship who doesn't necessarily need the legal and social acceptance that marriage offers. So cohabitation attracts a certain kind of person that does not want the traditional gender roles and desires equality between the couple, the partners, regardless of gender, and they want less specialization. They want more of a team of taking care of the home and that sort of thing, and taking care of work. Also, they have a greater desire for individual freedom. Cohabiting couples are twice as likely to be interracial than married couples. Very interesting. Half of cohabitations last a year or less. 1/6 make it 3 years, and 1/10 last 5 or more years. So it's definitely from everyone. This is not what you would see with marriages, right? So it is definitely understood to be more temporary from the people who enter it. Women are more likely to be older and better educated than men in the cohabiting couple, but still the traditional patterns prevail. Men tend to be older, both in married couples, and better educated in both married couples and cohabiting couples. But this gap is closing among cohabiting couples, and you see a higher percentage of couples who break that pattern. Unmarried couples are also looking more similar to cohabiting couples on income and labor force participation, but not so much for education. Hispanic women and men, yes, they do see similar education patterns when you compare them to married couples, but other groups diverged, other racial groups. Married women are becoming more like cohabiting women. So you see, when you see these transitions of which is shaping which, married women are becoming more egalitarian, and they're becoming more participating in labor force, in the workforce. So you see that married women are becoming more like cohabiting women. It's not like cohabiting women are becoming more like married women. You also see a greater difference between cohabiting couples who have never married or divorced than a distinction between cohabiting couples and married or single couples. So this is just to say there's a huge variety of cohabiting couples. We have a big difference between people who have never married and people who have divorced that are cohabiting, then a distinction between the cohabiting couples collectively and married or single people. So demographically, they represent a pretty wide group, and they don't look too different from married or single people. All right, and so it's important to nuance cohabitation. There are 4 main reasons that people cohabit, and these have very different outcomes for the relationship. A lot of data a lot of people who are against cohabitation will tell you that if you cohabit, you are more likely to divorce. And yes, that is true. However, it is not true that all cohabiting is the same. There are different reasons that people enter into cohabitation, and these have very different outcomes for that relationship. And so we're going to look at these now. So this is very important social data for you to understand cohabiting in a more nuanced way. So if you do not want your cohabiting relationship to affect your divorce, to lead to a greater likelihood of divorce, think about the reasons why you're cohabiting and that sort of thing. 46% of cohabiting couples see themselves as precursors to marriage. They understand themselves as, yes, I want to marry this person. It's going to happen in the not too distant future. And this is just one step along that road. So they are very much like, this is the person I want to get married, and this is the person I want to get married to. And that's mutual within their cohabiting arrangement. 29% of cohabitors see it as co-residential marriage. They're uncertain about both the relationship, this specific relationship, and the value of marriage. So some of them don't even want to get married, and they aren't sure if this is the person that they want to spend the rest of their life with. So they're unsure on 2 fronts. So they call this co-residential dating. 15% of trial cohabitors believe in marriage. So they're certain on that front, but they don't know if it'll work with this individual. So they're like, okay, I believe in marriage, and I think that this might be the person I want to marry, but this is a good way for me to test that. I don't want to end up getting divorced 2 years after because I realize I can't live with this person. So it's kind of like the test drive. It's like, I want to buy a car, but I'm not sure which one. That sort of mentality. That's the trial cohabs. And then 10% do not believe in marriage at all, but they are very permanently committed to their partner. They say, we are never going to get married. I am never going to get married to anyone, but I am going to be committed to my partner for the rest of my life. And that's 10%. This is a higher number in other countries, but This is the American context within this study. So let's see what happens with these different couples. Okay, so the people who, and this is kind of reordered, before this previous slide put them in the order of how common it was. And then this one put it in the order of how likely they are to be married at the end of their time. And I added everything together. So they had all of their couples that they went to in 1987 and 1988. And then they went back to them after 5 to 7 years to see if they were still together. So this is what they found. It's fascinating. So out of all the cohabiting couples, there were 100 couples altogether, 21 of them still lived together unmarried. 40%, or 40 of them, 40%, same thing. 40 of them had gotten married, and 39% had separated. So like an equal number had separated compared to marriage, but 60 of them were still together after 5 to 7 years. But let's break down how this looks within the different types. So the people who it was a substitute for marriage, they had really good outcomes. They're like, remember, these were the people who, this was only 10%. This is only 10 of the couples. These were the people who were like, I'm never going to get married, but I'm going to be committed for the rest of my life to this person. So it ended up that 39 of them were still together in that arrangement, but 25% had gotten married, even though they said they were never going to get married. But that amounted to 64% of them being together after 5 to 7 years. Pretty good outcome. Precursor to marriage group had the highest outcome. So these were the people who, again, said, I want to get married, and I want to get married to this person, and this is the step on this journey. 52% had actually gotten married. 17% were still living together but not married, for a total of 69% of them still together 5 to 7 years later. And the other groups didn't have nearly as good of an outcome. They hovered around 50%, so half of them being still together in some capacity after the 5 to 7 years. The trial marriage, this was, again, the group who said, I want to get married, but I don't know if it's to this person. 49% of them were together still by the end of that time period. As you can see, 21% were still living together in that arrangement. 28% had gotten married, but just under half. The other half had split. And for the co-residential dating, saying, I'm not sure if I want to get married, and I'm not sure if I want to get married to this person, but we're kind of just dating while we live together. This ended up being 54% of people being together 5 to 7 years later in some sort of capacity. 33% had gotten married, 21% were still living together. So you can see that how the reasons why you move in together and your understanding of your relationship and the cohabiting pattern has an impact on, have repercussions on how you are going to fare 5 to 7 years later. So there's really something important to keep in mind, and to think not only personally, but to nuance this data that you often will see about negative outcomes. We can't treat all cohabiting relationships equally. They're not the same. All right, so larger ramifications. The purpose of cohabiting changes attitudes on many things, gender roles, commitment, that sort of thing. So why people get together really really shapes the way that they live together. Cohabitation is a transition for whites, typically, a transition into marriage or a transition out of that relationship if you decide that's the way you want to go. And it's a substitute for blacks. You'll see a lot more times that this is the way black families have decided to arrange themselves. It's interesting, though, that blacks actually prefer marriage more than whites. When you ask them survey and interview data, countless studies show that blacks actually prefer marriage more than whites do. But they don't often find themselves in situations that are conducive to marriage. Either they can't afford to move in together on their own, one of them is unemployed, there's can be a lot of factors that are going on within these families. So that's usually what ends up shaping blacks using cohabitation as a substitute rather than entering marriage. Couples who cohabit before marriage are more likely to divorce, but this is not causal, right? Important to keep in mind. Those who are willing to cohabit are very different demographically and are more likely to accept divorce to begin with. So that's something also very important to keep in mind, is there's this self-selection. People who cohabit are not going to be these people who are most against divorce typically tend to have really high levels of religiosity and sexual conservatism, that sort of thing. And these are the same people that aren't going to cohabit. So we are parsing people into different categories. So we shouldn't say it's the cohabiting that causes the divorce. It's just this whole worldview that divorce isn't such a bad deal. It can actually be a great thing if you're in a nasty relationship. And so these sorts of attitudes it's like a constellation of values within different populations' heads. With so many people cohabiting, cohabitation could change the way we think about relationships. So just consider that with the way that as more and more people do it, it's going to shape the way we talk about relationships as a whole. So questions. The one that we're going to look at here, there's a whole slew of questions. This third one at the bottom. There's a whole slew of questions right here. But you do not need to answer all of them. Answer the ones that make the most sense for you to answer. And so dive into it with that in mind. But I'm going to offer a few questions for you to think about and answer in a succinct and coherent way, but don't feel like you need to be exhaustive of all of these questions. How does this inform the ethics readings? All this that we've learned about in this article. Should any of the ethics readings come to different conclusions based on this data? Does cohabitation in its many varieties warrant a betrothal status, as we talked about in one of the readings? What does this do to an understanding of indissolubility of marriage, not being able to dissolve marriage, and that sort of thing? What does this do to that sort of understanding? And how and when does the sacrament happen in a theology that incorporates betrothal? So when does the sacrament happen in your estimation? Think theologically. If we have betrothal, when does the sacrament of matrimony happen? Anyways, these are a variety of ways that you could address this data in conjunction with the readings, and that's what I kind of want you to do with this question. All right, and then moving right along. All right, now we're going to dive into ethical methods. This will help us when we're working on our case studies. So we're going to talk about the three main branches, because all God's children got opinions. This is so true, right? It doesn't take a social scientist to know that. So we're going to look at three main ethical branches today. We're going to look at deontology, utilitarianism, and virtue ethics. Just to give you some kind of pictures of what these are, deontology is all about rules and figuring out what the code, the right, the duty is in any situation, and it is something that we are supposed to be able to know and access through our rational capacity. And we are supposed to will that it would happen. It's not so much that it comes out the way we planned, but we act according to the right, and then that is all that we can do. And below that, we see utilitarianism, the scales, weighing pleasure and pain, and trying to figure out how to make the greatest good for the greatest number. Utilitarianism is all about outcomes and how to maximize happiness. And then to the left, we see virtue ethics, doing what is right simply for what is doing right. Different from deontology, though, in that it is about looking to become a more virtuous person, and to weigh what is right in any given situation. So it doesn't so much have specific moral codes so much as it weighs the whole of the situation and figures out which moral codes will apply. All right. So how we'll proceed, you're going to see 6 bullet points in each of these slides. It's going to be the major thinker or thinkers of this movement, and usually of its founding. We're going to see how each philosophy argues that we live a moral life. We're going to look at the moral anthropology, which basically means what is the understanding of the human person within this idea of morality. We're going to look at the primary tenet to each thing we can. So you're learning. When I learned these methods, I learned 2 weeks of doctoral level instruction and reading and research on each of these. You're learning it in a very brief class, but hopefully we can distill the most important things from each method and give you an idea of what those look like and what it is and how to apply them to real life. So that's when we're going to look at the primary tenet. There's usually one idea that we can say centralizes and focuses the entire method. Next bullet point, we'll look at an extension or development of a primary tenet. And then we're going to look at a basic pro and a basic con to each of these methods. I totally know that there could be whole slideshows on all of these and really get to the heart and soul of all of them, but we're not going to do that. And we're going to introduce these three major methods, and there are methods beyond these as well, in order to really explore, to kind of like briefly entertain them, and then we can explore real life through these lenses. So that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to figure out how to apply them. And that's where the case studies are going to come into play. So looking at deontology or deontology, depending on how you like to say it, the major person in this from this is Immanuel Kant. He was this Prussian guy. He had a very funny way of going about his life. He very much lived by his philosophy. He was not one to not practice what he preached. And he had a very rigorous lifestyle. People said you could set a watch by Immanuel Kant's life. And he had a very interesting social life. I believe that at one point he stopped having sex even with his wife because he was worried that he was using her in this act. And so this was a whole, he was a very, I think people who develop their own means and philosophies are going to be different kind of birds. So anyway, he's a different kind of guy, but definitely, developed a really strong, rigorous code that people who have never even heard of Immanuel Kant or deontology still express these ideas. His ideas come down to an idea of there being a code. There's duty, there's rules. There are greater moral codes and duties. We don't need to think about what are the consequences of our actions. He says, who cares about the consequences? That's not what we're about. We're about doing the right thing at whatever cost. And we have imperatives that we need to live up to as people and as a society. So this was his argument. He says that we are his moral anthropology is rooted in the rational actor, not empirical reality, right? Not what we can measure, not any sort of consequences or outcomes. It's all about the rational actor discerning what is right, what is the code that applies, and exercising his or her will in that situation. So yeah, that sort of thing. He might have said that Daniel in his lion's den, I used him as a virtue ethicist approach. He might have said that he was just simply following the code to uphold God, but a virtue ethicist would say, no, Daniel weighed all of these different things and what was the right duty. Daniel acknowledged duty to his king as well as duty to his God, and so he needed to weigh these different things. So yeah, anyways, we can look at different things from a variety of viewpoints, of course. Categorical imperative is the major philosophical tenet that comes out of deontology, and that is basically you act as though your will would be universalized. So in other words, it's kind of the opposite of what your mom said, like, if everybody else were doing it, would you do it? Instead, you say, what if everyone else were to do what I am doing? What would society look like? Would it be chaos or would it be order? And this is a way that we can understand what the categorical imperative is compelling us to do, that sort of thing. So basically, what would happen if the basic way to understand the categorical imperative is just what would happen if everybody else were to do as I am doing. Yes. And something else that developed out of this is people are never mere means, right? We should never use people as a means to something else. They can be part of a means, but we always need to recognize that they are an end in and of themselves. That is fundamental to being a moral person, that people have intrinsic value, and you need to recognize that. So a pro to this is that we are held to a higher call, that we have these duties and morals and codes and these sorts of things that are outside of us, that we can use to strive to be better people. A major con here is that it misses that duties can conflict with one another. It doesn't see that perhaps the idea that fidelity to one's spouse might conflict with provision for the house. If, for example, a lot of people found themselves in the Great Depression, if we look at, was it The Jungle by Upton Sinclair? He talks about this family where the woman was in a situation where she was going to lose her job if she didn't sleep with her boss. And she never wanted to sleep with her boss, but she knew that her children were going to die if she lost her job. And so Immanuel Kant kind of brushes over the fact that important duties can conflict with one another. And he just assumes that it's all going to work out. So that would be the con that you could say within Immanuel Kant's schema. Major ideas in utilitarianism. We're going to shift gears now. This is pretty much the antithesis of Kant's ideas, because it's very much rooted in outcomes and tangibility and that sort of thing. John Stuart Mill was not the founder of utilitarianism, but really articulated it and developed it in what we know as its modern form. John Stuart Mill is another crazy character. I feel so sad whenever I read about his biography. His father believed he was a very promising young lad, and I mean a very, very young lad. And his father was friends with Jeremy Bentham, who you can see here on the 5th bullet point, who actually is probably one of them. He really began to articulate this idea. You might want to call him the father of utilitarianism, but it was a little too crazy, and Mill kind of made it in this more palatable form. We'll get to that in a second. But John Stuart Mill was like 3 years old. He was the firstborn, and his father said he is going to be a smart young lad. And Bentham was like, I agree. I think you should teach him everything that he needs to know. And he was completely isolated from any other child until he was around, I believe he said he saw another child aside from his siblings when he was 14 years old. That was the first time he ever saw a child besides his siblings. All of the money, the education was given to John as the firstborn, and he was in charge of instructing his younger siblings. He was like fluent in I can't remember which language it was. I believe it was Latin at 3 or 4, and then Greek by 5. Maybe I'm reversing those. But he had command of Latin and Greek by the time he was 5, written and speaking, and reading, of course. And he was just given these really difficult tasks and never really given a chance to be a child, to explore life, to figure it out on his own. And given this really crass utilitarianism that Jeremy Bentham designed, which was really based on like pleasure, that life is all about pleasure. And by the time he was like 20 or something, he had this John Stuart Mill, by the time he was 20, had this nervous breakdown. He's like, if this is all there is to life, I don't really want there to be life. And out of this depression, he started to create relationships with people and re-articulate this utilitarianism. He didn't reject utilitarianism, but he's like, this isn't what it's all about. I need to hone this and refine it. It's really crass the way it is. And he later, I believe he wed. I'm pretty sure he married this woman. But he had a love of his life, and he was really into women's rights, hugely ahead of his time, and was into the women's rights movement and trying to figure out ways to allow women to participate in society and advocate for their full inclusion. So anyway, it's a really interesting character, depressing as all heck as far as his childhood goes. Okay, next is How to Live a Moral Life. And John Stuart Mill argues that it's all about pleasure. It's about happiness. It's about maximizing the good for all people. There is a debate within the utilitarian community as to whether or not outcomes or expectations is the way you're supposed to do it. So, for example, you could try to maximize pleasure, but it kind of fails. You end up doing something really badly. You're like, oh, I'm going to throw a party for my friend, and it's going to be a surprise, it's going to be great. And it ends up that this person doesn't like surprise parties. So in this event, then the outcome would be bad. But as far as your expectations goes, your most reasonable expectations, you were expecting that they were to like it. So was that the right or the wrong choice? Depending on if you are an act-based utilitarian, which emphasizes outcomes, I'd say that was the wrong choice. Regardless of whatever you try to do, what matters is the actual happiness at the end of the day. Or if you are a rule-based utilitarianism, which is more about expectations. What are the rules? People generally like having surprise parties thrown for them. That was a reasonable expectation. Your efforts and all of the things and all that you did was to try to throw a good surprise party, and it was just unexpected that your friend didn't like that. So an act-based utilitarian would say that was the wrong thing for you to do because it didn't result in the highest amount of pleasure. And a rule-based utilitarian would say that was the right thing for you to do because it was within reasonable expectations that it would have resulted in the greatest amount of pleasure. So that's that debate that's going on. Next, we have the moral anthropology. John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham did not believe that this sort of utilitarian calculus was going against human condition. In fact, they said this is rooted in human condition. We're always trying to maximize pleasure. This is a way to make sure that we maximize pleasure not just for ourselves, but for everyone involved. So that we are pleasure-motivated creatures who are always focused on results and what we can see and what we can feel at the end of the day. So they said that this was very much, as far as their experience and their understanding of society and people, that this was very much what we do already and going to be a natural ethical method for people. The major tenet here is the greatest happiness principle, which is just to maximize the greatest good for the greatest number, finding out how to maximize pleasure for the greatest number of people. A development, just as far as utilitarianism goes, as I said, Jeremy Bentham had this hedonic calculus, which had like 7, I believe, facets to it of different, like there's the intensity of pleasure, the duration of pleasure, and these sorts of things, and that you could calculate line for line exactly what was the greatest action based on the presumed expectations of what was going to result. But Mill was like, you know what, like you focus a lot on the quantity of pleasure and these sorts of things, but there's a lot of qualitative pleasure. For example, it might take you a really long time to be able to play the violin well, but when you get there, it's going to be so much beauty and joy. But in Jeremy Bentham's model, the work that it would take would never warrant getting to be a good violin or fiddle player. But Mill's like, no, these sorts of qualitative pleasures are important, and Jeremy Bentham's model does not take this into account. And that even at the end of the day, he's saying, there is, the pleasure you get from a good slice of pie or that sort of thing is not the same sort of thing as the pleasure you get from reading like a story of the saints or hearing beautiful music, seeing something that enriches you as a person. So Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill were at odds as far as that goes. And Mill kind of wanted to make this a more sophisticated idea, which is probably the reason it has lasted to this day. I'm sure if Jeremy Bentham had been the sole constructor of utilitarianism and all we had was his hedonic calculus, it would have been kind of disregarded as silliness. So yeah, we owe Mill utilitarianism for today, for better or for worse. It's easily measurable. These are the pros, that it's very easily measurable. This is one of the reasons that a lot of U.S. law is based on utilitarianism. We can see it. It has real outcomes. It's great for the public sphere where there's competing ideologies. At least we can say, well, these are the results. What are the kind of results do we want? So very easily measurable. The con is that it misses higher duties. It kind of disregards any sort of idea that there's something beyond the person, that there's some sort of empirical good that we are subject to, because it's all concentrated on what happens and what's the pleasure involved. All right, and then moving to virtue ethics. Major thinkers here. So Aristotle was the big one back in the day, who really began this formulation of virtue ethics, and then it kind of got forgotten for a long time until Thomas Aquinas kind of resurrected Aristotle's thinking and really gave it a very Christian flavor to it. The idea that Aristotle's idea that we have a natural end, and then it's pointing towards this good, this eudaimonia, this idea of having the good life at the end of the day, at the end of our lifetime, that we have lived a good life. This is what he believed virtue ethics could help us achieve. Whereas with Aquinas, it was like, yes, we have this good life here on earth, but it doesn't end, and it points beyond into this supernatural end as well. So we have a natural end to our goodness here on earth, and then we have a supernatural end, which never ends actually, because it's eternal life, with this beatific vision, this glimpse of God that we are going to have in the afterlife. So this is how virtue ethics has developed both within the secular and the Christian tradition. With the question of how to live a moral life, it is that you point your life toward the virtuous path. You try to figure out what other people have done, what other people who you admire, who are the heroes in your life, what have they done, what are the virtues that they do, what are the practices that they bring, and then emulate those, and you will also walk down this path. And also had this idea that virtue is like a muscle. It's going to be weak at first, but with your own perseverance, going to the gym, like you're the one who has to get yourself up in the morning, that sort of thing. With this perseverance, you will become a more virtuous person, and as you exercise these virtues, these muscles, you will become ever ready, and it will become much more natural to you. I don't know if you've ever taken up a sport in adulthood or recently, but sometimes things can be really, or even a musical instrument, sometimes things can be really awkward at first, and then it becomes very natural. It's something that you don't even think about, and you very quickly acclimate to it. This is the same sort of thing that Aristotle was thinking happens with virtue. At first, it might be very difficult to be a virtuous person, but then it becomes natural, and you don't even think about it. It becomes second nature to you. The moral anthropology that's going on here is that people are happiest when they live a life of virtue. This is that all human beings share this in common, that we are actually not happiest when we're trying to maximize pleasure or live by specific codes, but when we are living the good life, the life of virtue, we can embrace the world around us. We have an inner sense of conviction and care and triumph, and that these sorts of things lead to our own happiness, and that this is intrinsic to the moral person, our moral anthropology. So the first major tenet is that we cultivate virtuous habits for virtuous dispositions. It's not so much that we are honorable or that we are just or that we are faithful. It's that we say, okay, what do faithful people do? What do honorable people do? What do just people do? And we look to those habits. Very important here. The habits come first. And then in exercising those habits, we slowly over time develop the dispositions as well. So if, for example, you want to be a pious person, you're like, I really think that piety is great, but I just don't feel it in my heart. Kant might say, don't do it then. That doesn't have integrity. Mill might say, well, what sort of happiness is pretending that you're something you're not going to bring you? Whereas Aristotle or Aquinas would say, yeah, that's exactly right. You have these, you have this longing within you for piety, and you're not going to develop it by just continuing to long for it. You're going to have to take up these dispositions and cultivate habits. And just like practicing the guitar, maybe it's really funky to put your fingers in certain places in the beginning, but then after a while it becomes very natural and you can't even imagine not being able to do it. Same thing with piety. You see people, whatever it looks like in your faith tradition, if it means kneeling with eyes closed and palms together and head bowed, and you start taking on these postures and you think, what do holy people, what do pietistic people do? Who do they reach out to? And then you start to feel the kindlings and the beginnings of piety as it grows within your heart. So this is the virtue ethics point of view of how we become good people. Where to begin, though? So it says, what do we do? I'm not quite sure. We always look to the virtuous person. That's how we start. We say, who are the pious people? Who are the just people? Who are the moderate people? What are these sorts of virtues I want to grow within my own self? And I look around and I find the people who are living those lives, maybe not in every aspect, and maybe I don't want to become just like them. Maybe they fail in certain other ways, but they do really emulate justice. They do really emulate piety, and I want that. And so I'm going to emulate those habits that they have within that regard. So that's how you do that. The pro to virtue ethics is it allows a person to discern. That's great. It allows us to think about, it's not just a code where you are really constrained within that behavior. You must always follow the code. It really allows you to take into account the whole situation of what's going on. What are the virtues that are important to this situation? Are there certain virtues within the situation that trump other virtues, and that sort of thing? The con is it's hard to know what virtues are, especially when we take social science into account. Not every culture values something that you might think is fundamental to the human experience, like equality or diversity, and these sorts of things that you might find very relevant. Not all cultures do. So it's hard for anyone to know what their virtues are because we're kind of constrained within our own cultural context of what is good and what is bad. We often forget that. So it's hard to know exactly what it is. Aristotle himself was coming from this very masculine sort of Athenian place. The word virtue, in fact, comes from the Latin vir, meaning man, because he didn't believe that women were capable of achieving the virtues. They had their own sort of household virtues that they could achieve, but they weren't the same sort of things as true virtues. So as we can see, there's limits to what this is. It's not straightforward, basically. All right, and here we're going to have just a quick practice run. Okay. Here's our situation. It's World War II Germany. You are hiding Jews in your basement. Okay, so you're a good guy. Good job. A German soldier knocks on your door and asks if you're hiding Jews. What do you do if you are a deontologist, if you are a utilitarian, if you are a virtue ethicist? Go ahead and pause your video and think about what that could be within each of those. And then I'll discuss what I think each of these positions would have come to. All right, so go ahead and pause it now. All right, have you thought about it already? Because I'm about to talk about my answers. I don't want to spoil it for you. Okay, so hopefully you've thought about it. This is what I came to. If you are a deontologist, I think that you would tell the truth. I think that you would say, yes, I'm hiding Jews, because you would think to yourself, what if everyone in the world just lied? They lied, and truth-telling was not an important code. Basically, society would fall apart if truth-telling was no longer an important code that dictated human behavior. So I think that the deontologist in this situation would say, no, I've got to tell the truth. However, you could make the argument, which I'm sure some of you might, that the deontologist could also say that preservation of human life is an important moral code. But as you can see, the deontologist is never going to say that truth-telling is not. So this is, again, the con. Like, here we are having two important virtues, preservation of human life and truth-telling. I'd say that they are both important, but they're in conflict with one another. How do we reconcile this, right? The deontology does not tell us how to do that. It assumes that these virtues are not going to come in conflict. Okay, now utilitarian. What did you come up with utilitarian? I would say the utilitarian would lie and not think too much about it, because they would say, hey, as far as I'm concerned, like, my happiness is better off. It's clear that the Jews who are hiding in my basement are better off. If this soldier never finds out that I'm lying, then as far as he knows, good. All of us Germans are in solidarity with each other and everything's fine. So he's happy. So if I can get away with my lie, then it's pretty good. Now, however, if a utilitarian were to say, it's pretty good odds that I am not going to get away with this lie. So utilitarian, they said there's a reason they came knocking on my door. I don't know if this question is going to end at just, nope, I'm not hiding Jews. Okay, have a great day. So the utilitarian might say, you know what, I think that these people are going to get caught anyway. If I lie and I get caught about it, that's no good. If I say, yes, I think I heard something in my basement, come look, because I think I'm going to get caught anyway, then it preserves my happiness. It turns in the Jewish people right away, but I might assume that they are going to get caught anyway, and it makes this soldier of mine think he's my comrade, so it makes him happy. So utilitarian could go that way too, depending on what they thought the outcome was going to be with their actions, right? So very interesting the way that can flip either way. A virtue ethicist, probably in this situation, since they're already hiding the Jews, has already decided that the preservation of human life is a more important virtue than truth-telling, because they're already deceiving in the fact that they're hiding, right? They're hiding people. They're already deceiving. So they have already decided that within this situation, this context, that non-cooperation with the German soldier is more important because it preserves this human life in this morally fraught way. And I don't really think that you can come up with a virtue ethicist argument why this person would suddenly, who was already hiding Jews, is going to switch on that. So I think that the virtue ethicist would have to lie and do everything in their power to conceal that, and be willing to suffer any sort of consequences that came out of not lying. So that would be what I would think the virtue ethicist would do, whereas the utilitarian is going to consider outcomes, and the deontologist is going to consider codes. So this is what I think that they would come out to in this whole thing. I want to tell you this other quick thing on NPR that I heard the other day on Philosophy Talk. I guess it wasn't the other day. It was probably more like 3 years ago, but it's still with me. But they had a deontologist and a utilitarian and another ethicist, and I can't remember what strand of ethical study they came out of, but the deontologist was trying to argue that everyone deep down is a deontologist, and they were talking about torture. And he said, no, and he was arguing, no, you can't torture because torturing is just wrong. It's interesting too. A virtue ethicist would argue that torture is wrong because of what it does to the torturer. Very interesting, right? So it's bad that we are, of course, that we are not respecting the dignity of human life, the virtue ethicist would say. But the virtue ethicist would also say, think about what we're doing to the torturer. We are making them a less compassionate person. We are instilling vice rather than virtue, a value of authority rather than human person. So the virtue ethicist focuses on that. Fascinating, I think. But going back to the deontologist and the utilitarian, the deontologist, as you can assume, where people are never to be treated as a means to an end, is like, no, torture is never okay because of this. The utilitarian's like, well, we need to think about how many lives are saved as a result of this torture. And if social science happens to find that torture is not actually an effective way, then I can say, okay, then we can't. But we really need to see what are the pros and cons and weighing both sides. And then the deontologist was so funny and clever. He said, it was a female utilitarian, a male deontologist. He said to her, so I believe, though, that deep down you really are a deontologist when it comes to it. He says, what if you knew you could save 1,000 lives by torturing a man? Would you do it? And she said, absolutely. And he said, what if he wasn't talking? She's like, well, then at least I tried. And he says, but what if he would talk if you were to torture his 8-year-old daughter, would you do it? And she said, absolutely not. And he said, why not? And she couldn't think of the reason why. And it was so funny because he put her into this moral code sort of position where you don't torture innocent lives that have nothing to do with this, right? And that was the code that was suddenly operating within her. And the whole audience laughed, and even she chuckled about it a bit. But it was really illuminating from that case as well. All right, now we're going to look more deeply at another case, and we're going to discuss this next case that has to do more directly with our course material. It has to do with family, and we're going to discuss this either in the Zoom session or in the online forums, your choice depending on your availability. So let's get into it. So this was a case that was written by my friend Patrick Lannon. I want to give him credit for it. He also is a GTU graduate, like myself. Okay, so we've got Julie. Julie had grown up in a rural part of her country. She had gone to the teacher's college and completed an associate's degree in elementary education, which was an extraordinary accomplishment for a woman of her country, let alone for a woman from a remote village such as hers. She returned to her village to teach, and then she started to date Joseph. She and Joseph had grown up together, and they had always been companions. But the time away at teacher's college, and perhaps the time that allowed Joseph to mature and made him appear very attractive to her. She knew later that she had fallen for him. At the time, she knew that she had hoped to marry someone who would love her and offer a financially secure environment to raise children in. She felt that Joseph cared for her deeply, but she doubted his ability to sustain a family financially. Joseph had not finished elementary school. He had left school to work on the family farm and to trap fish that helped feed his family. She figured Joseph would continue to live by subsistence farming, which offered less security than she had hoped for. Julie's prospects changed when she met Antonio. Antonio managed a resort that catered to tourists. Julie did not feel for Antonio in the same way that she cared for Joseph, but she knew that he had the education and the employment history that made financial security much more likely. When Antonio told Julie he hoped to marry her someday, she broke things off with Joseph and started to date Antonio. A year later, they were married, and after 5 years of marriage, they had 2 children. Julie felt comfortable with Antonio. She felt he was a friend. She would not say that they loved each other in a romantic way, but there was some kind of love there. This was not the marriage she had hoped for, but when given a choice between financial security and romantic affection, she had prioritized security. Because Antonio managed a resort, he was often required to work late in the evening. When work kept him too late, he would call Julie to let her know that he needed to stay at the resort for the night. Although Julie initially trusted Antonio, she lived in a rural area. Gossip was a common pastime. People like to say the gossip might not be true, but it was nearly always true. But that it was nearly true. So when people started to make comments about Antonio's extramarital affairs, Julie became concerned. She confronted him about it. Antonio told her that he did occasionally spend the night with other women, but he assured Julie that these relationships were never serious and that he would always care for her and the children. He did not promise to retain an exclusive relationship with her, but he did assure her that she would never have to worry. So here's our question. What do you think of the morality of this situation? And as you consider your position, do you think your arguments come out of a frame of deontology, utilitarianism, virtue, a combination, or somewhere else entirely? So think about it. There's lots to unpack with this case. Think about it. If you feel like following the brief methods that are offered in our syllabus for the paper, just briefly, what are the ideas of this case? This is what's going on. Some people might think this, but they'd be wrong because of this. So yeah, you can follow that if you want to answer this, but you can just answer the question as it is here. But if you'd like practice for our paper, you always have that option as well. Okay, so go ahead and answer that question. And this concludes our video for meeting 3A. I hope to see you in Zoom, but if not, I will read your postings in the online discussion. Thanks.